Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. We just got word that everyone should be in our virtual building right now. I am so excited to serve as your host or your moderator today. My name is LaRonda Julian. I am the Director of Volunteerism for the Community of Human and Organizational Learning. And today we have with us Dr. Martha Acosta, and she is going to be presenting on a topic that I thought was pretty interesting: accountability and blame, breaking up for good. So, you all might be familiar with some of Martha's work, but she is the senior moderator of corporate learning for Harvard Business Publishing. And she's done a lot of work with Todd Conklin over at Los Alamos. And she is going to give us some good information today. One thing I want you all to do for me, just as a courtesy, if you're not speaking, please make sure that you all remain on mute. Please feel free to type anything that you would like in the chat. And Martha is going to share with you how she would like you to communicate with her while we're on. So Martha, go ahead on and take it away.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, LaRonda, and thank you, everyone. I am sharing my screen right now, so hopefully all of you will be able to see that, but means I won't necessarily be able to see you all very well, but I'm going to try and change my view so that I can see you and also see you when you type into chat here. So accountability and blame, breaking up for good. Now, I think of accountability and blame, and many of you are safety leaders, many of you work with leaders. We think of these as sort of these star-crossed lovers. They're from two different worlds, but they just can't get enough of each other. And when they get together, it is big trouble. So many of us have struggled already for many years on trying to figure out how we get accountability and blame to ultimately let each other go. And I think what I want to cover today is talking about how we do this. Now, let me see, there we go. So I want, many of you are familiar with HOP, with human and organizational performance. Many of you are familiar with the 5 principles that come from Todd Conklin. And we've been talking a lot on our leadership journey about how being error-free just doesn't make any sense, because all human beings are fallible. We all make mistakes, and focusing, trying to get rid of people's fallibility is almost impossible. And I'm going to make the argument that trying to get rid of blame, or having being a blame-free culture, is just as difficult. So let me share this story with you. When I was a little girl, and this is the early 70s, so give my parents a little bit of a break here. And they're not American, so think about that too. When I was a little girl and I would stub my toe, or I'd drop my ice cream or something like that, or have any kind of mishap, my mom would try and turn that into a teaching moment. And this is how she did it. She would say, God is punishing you for taking that extra cookie, or God is punishing you for being mean to your brother yesterday. And it might be kind of a perverse way of how we talk about leadership, which is inspiring others in your absence by creating this this fear that I had of doing something wrong. But this really illustrates that shame and guilt are social emotions, and they actually are incredibly effective in creating the boundaries in our societies. So, it turns out that my parents never needed to punish me as I got older, because if I ever did anything wrong, they'd come home and I would be, prostrate on the ground, crying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, because I was so overcome with the guilt of that. So even though shame and guilt are actually really effective at enforcing social norms, the presence of them they override our urge to do something, taboo. But, just because it can be effective in creating a society, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily effective in being able to create safety in the organization. And that's really what we want to dive into. Guilt-free humans are very rare. We call them sociopaths and psychopaths. The real diagnosis is actually antisocial personality disorder, which is actually much more revealing about that. Our shame and our guilt, they are what make us social humans. And of course, they also create problems for us. But this is probably the reason, the close association between these emotions and a society that has boundaries is why we have this situation where accountability and blame can't seem to break up with each other. So I'm going to ask you all a question, and I think that you can, let me look and see here. I'm going to check out how, yeah, I think you can chat to everyone in the meeting. So I'm going to ask you this question. This is a sort of a look of accountability that many of our accountability matrices in our organizations are based on. So if people are unaware of the expectation, or they're unable to fulfill the expectation, or they do not perform as expected, which of these do you think is blameworthy? So you can just type in an answer, you can type in a number. Which of these do we see as being blameworthy? So Kevin's put in 3. Okay. Jennifer says none of them. 0. Some people have 3. Okay, great. Good. Now, for those of you who said 3, that is how we have been operating for a long time. So, if people are behaving badly, and guilt works to help us conform to the norms of our society, right? Then guilt can be good. So, blame, we see this as a way of holding people accountable and keeping them in line, right? So this is a perfectly reasonable way to start thinking about things. But that's if we think of safety as a choice or not a choice, or arising from ultimately the human action. But when we look at number 3 and we look at it from a HOP lens, we recognize that there's lots of other reasons why people might not perform as planned. So is it an error? Have we created an error-prone situation? Are there some unexpected conditions? Do we have ambiguity in the way that we've set our expectations, or we've set mixed messages with multiple non-compatible expectations? Have we over-relied on expertise in order to create a safe condition? Or is there a lack of resilience in our operations, in our tools, or in our equipment? So if we realize that even if people do not perform as expected, there is also there are some other systemic situations here. So I want us to think about that accountability isn't really the same thing. And we have talked about it this way for a long time. Accountability isn't really the same thing as personal responsibility. Accountability, when we think about it as a leadership practice, as a way, it is really a way to maintain systems integrity and systems control. And then it's not really a personal thing. We have to think, how do we create an environment where people can meet those expectations? And if we look back at all of the ways that an organizational system can keep people from doing that, or make them think that the best decision is not to do the procedure as it's been written, but to do it differently, it's really important. Now, I want to throw out right now a lot of things, something that is actually kind of a difficult thing for us to talk about and to think about, but that makes this even a little bit more a little different. Let's talk, we've got emojis that you can use. Give me a thumbs up using your emojis. If you work in an industry where there is a higher than normal incidence of substance abuse disorder, who works in that? And I don't know if I'm seeing emojis, but because I'm sharing my screen. But I imagine maybe I'll see it on people's. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Chris. Healthcare. Healthcare is a situation where we have a much higher incidence of substance abuse disorder. I also work with Mars Inc., and many of you might not know that they're a longtime client of mine, that they are big global leaders in veterinary care, and they have a very high incidence amongst veterinarians for mood disorder, particularly fatal ones. So there are a lot of suicides in the veterinary care world. Now, when we think about personal responsibility, or we think about reasons system, of identifying culpability. So his culpability model, sort of early on in that culpability model, is actually on the more culpable side of things. There's substance abuse, there's other situations in there. But now let's think about that. If we have industries where we've created a situation that drives certain mental health problems, is that a personal responsibility problem for these people? Or is that an other system that we as safety professionals need to be looking at and thinking about? How are we going to build controls for that hazard? Have we created a hazardous environment where we are driving that hazard for people where it's normal? And Jessica also says that in hospitality industry, that's a problem, and then construction and engineering. So think about these high stress jobs that we're putting people in. I mean, you can even think about it in terms of, we wouldn't put somebody working on a high-rise building in the construction industry and put them at the top of that at 50 stories up and make it difficult like we do for mental health support, make it difficult for them to sign up and get their fall protection, make it shameful for them to be asking for fall protection. Or we're not going to be sending messages like, well, when I was in school, I was walking around at 50 stories high and I was okay. So why are you having such a hard time staying up on top of this building, right? That's ridiculous. But we are in some of these industries talking about, we are, creating environments where we are seeing these incidences for mental health, which many of our societies still stigmatize, and yet we're not fully supporting and addressing those as hazards in our environment. So we need to be thinking about how do we change our attitudes towards what personal responsibility really means when we have an obligation as safety leaders to create systems that are safe for our people to work in. So, Tanya, you said something there that's gotten a lot of likes and loves. Tanya, do you want to share anything?
Well, all I said was that addiction is only a symptom. A lot of
Right.
people think it's a cause, but it's not. It reveals that there's something deeper that has to be looked into.
Yeah. And absolutely, as safety leaders, we need to be thinking about this. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that when we start separating our ideas of accountability and blame as a way of being able to manage our systems, we're going to run into some of these difficult questions. We're going to run into some of these stigmas and biases that we have about human beings, just like we did when we started to look at error differently, when we started to look at mistakes differently. So, you know, everybody probably knows this particular principle of human and organizational performance, that blame fixes nothing. And blame fixes nothing because it ignores our blue line. And worse, it drives out our curiosity for that blue line. So I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the blue line and the black line, but the black line is essentially work as planned, and the blue line is work as actually in practice. And that red line there, which both which Todd puts in and Bob puts in, is sort of that hazard line. And what we are paying attention to as safety leaders is we need to be curious enough about that blue line to know when it's moving towards that hazard. And I also think about that red line as being as changing as well, because that hazard is the line that moves and emerges based on changing conditions that we are working in. Now, blame and guilt, the problem with it, the reason why it doesn't fix anything, is because it's enforcing the tyranny of the black line. And the black line is not real. We've just imagined it. It might be helpful as a guidepost. I know many of us work in highly regulated environments, and that we get audited, the first thing people are going to be asking us for are our procedures. And it's not that we're going to ever stop writing procedures, but we also have to recognize that that isn't what we're managing to. Blame makes sense if we still believe that if everybody just sticks to the black line, then we'll be okay. So we can just shame and guilt people until they make the choice to follow that black line. But that's not really the world that we're living in. There's no black line. So let me ask you all a question. When you think about the relationship between blame and learning, what do you think the relationship between blame and learning is? Anything you think? Yeah. So Chris, you're saying, yeah, blame stifles learning, right? Blame breaks down learning. Yeah, this is what we know from studying psychological safety. That blue line, the reason why it's squiggly like that is because it's really a series of little learning curves. And in any point in learning, there's that dip, right? Where you're confused, where you don't know what's going on, right? When you're struggling to conquer a new idea or a new skill, the learning curve starts with a drop, and then you move up, and then you plateau when whatever it is that you learn no longer applies, will no longer improve your performance. So that blue line is certainly workers adapting to their conditions, but that adaptation is learning. And psychological safety is a necessary condition for organizational learning. That healthy relationship with failure, that growth mindset, that is that's part of what you have when you have psychological safety. Inclusivity, open conversation, willingness to help, willingness to ask for help. Blame erodes all of these things. So just like you're saying, blame really damages our ability to learn. Yeah. Dr. Hallnagel, the dichotomous relationship between blame and learning. Yeah. And I think now we can be sure. Let's look at it this way. there is no black line. So this comes from Michael Roberto at Bryant University, but he looks at work this way. Previously, and this is one of the problems, one of the things that I say all the time is leadership system is the meaning management system. So as leaders, what we're doing is we are creating the meaning context in which people work. And we have tended to look at work under this false analogy for a lot of the work that we do of looking at it as a factory, sort of that Tayloristic view that Todd talks about all the time. Well, in that routine, well understood work, yeah, there's low uncertainty and there's low failure rates. And failure should be an indicator of weaknesses in our system. So failure means that we actually do not understand what's going on. The systems that we think we have in place aren't working, and we need to change that. As you move up with more uncertainty, you also get more failure rates, and that failure is very important for us to be able to adapt. So in the variable, uncertain, and complex environment, we're trying to detect that early. We're thinking about our hypotheses of how things should be, and we're looking at the difference, the delta between our hypothesis and the reality, and we're adapting to that in order to be able to solve that problem in the moment. And then in super high uncertainty environments like pure innovation, pure science, we're seeking out the novel. We're seeking out where things don't make sense. And then failure becomes, we're creating an environment where failure doesn't have a negative consequence, and we have an opportunity to be very curious about that failure. That failure is illuminating the unknown for us, and that becomes a mechanism for discovery. There's no point in focusing on the black line in any of these kinds of work modes. We need to be aware of how people are working in our organization, and it might be all of these, it might be all along the line, but help them see where the incidence of uncertainty and failure for them to expect, and not create a blame situation. Try and address the blame that is natural in the way that humans interact with each other, and use that as a way to fully embrace how failure can help us learn. Yes, well, I mean, I think sort of the blameless situation, I mean, truly blameless, like people for whom blame absolutely means nothing to them. Like I said before, they're essentially sociopaths, psychopaths. That's not the real term. So, this is natural. So we should recognize, just like we recognize that error is natural, we should recognize that blame is just a very normal ego defense against painful emotions. And the fact is that even if you are a scientist and you are highly aware of the fact that failure is part of your innovation process, that does not mean that when you fail, when your experiment does not work, that you're not going to experience painful emotions, and that you might not experience the different kinds of blame. So 3 different kinds of blame posited here by these 2 authors in this article that I'm referencing. Extra punitive blame, what we normally see as we blame other people. Imputative blame, which is just avoiding blame altogether. And this imputative blame, when we get criticism about not blaming or separating blame from accountability, this is what people think that we might be doing, which really is a form of blame, just avoiding blame, just saying, oh, it's not a big deal, or nothing happened, or hiding it. That is incredibly dangerous as well, right? Because we want to be curious about our failures so that we can learn and continue to improve and identify hazards and build controls to those hazards. If we're impunitive, that's not helpful either. And then intropunitive, which is sort of what my parents were training me to be, is blaming yourself and taking that on. And it's still a defense against those painful emotions. We're trying to, we're going to take on those emotions ourselves. We're going to blame ourselves. We're avoiding the pain of having somebody else blame us. So it's still part of this whole psychological process. So what we actually need to do in order to create this breakup between blame and accountability is we need to process those painful emotions better in our organizations. We need to build, psychological and organizational, these psychological and organizational defenses that kind of get built into our systems for blaming and sort of justifying these feelings. We need to be working on how we can do that. So, this is basically, I mean, what we're dealing with here is, that classic blame cycle. We know that if someone makes a mistake, they feel blamed about it, then they're not going to share their mistakes, then you're not going to have good information. We're going to make poor decisions. We're going to have all of these unaddressed hazards and error traps. So, we just need to recognize that it's not a matter of just pretending that we can be blame-free, that we don't have emotions. We don't want to elevate psychopathy. We want to be able to manage this. So I just checking in with people. What do you think your blame tendency is? I'm definitely intrapunitive. Do you have a tendency to being extra punitive, impunitive? Go ahead and type it into chat. What's your self-reflection on that? Okay, yeah. All day long, Jen. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. I think, those of us work and home can be different. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that's actually a really insightful point, Katrina, that sort of survival. This is also, I mean, an ego defense is a survival strategy, right? It's an emotional survival strategy, and survival is different at home and at work. So at work, if you're not able to really be vulnerable, if you have all of these social cues that the way to survive is to push blame onto somebody else or to pretend nothing happened, that is those social cues are a system that drives behavior that's going to be different from necessarily what's going to be at home. At home, you might have a very different emotional environment to work in. So one of the things as leaders that we need to be aware of is what emotional environment are we creating? That emotion is meaningful. And if we go back to my definition of leadership as a system, is that it is the meaning-making system of an organization. So let's try and attach this now, like to accountability. Accountability, and if accountability is truly understanding that blue line, right, and setting up a system to support that blue line, whether it's people talking about what their experiences are, having support towards the outcomes that we want, having the controls to avoid that red line, having all of our organizational systems that are basically accountability is driving us, is our system for driving us towards performance in a shared way. Accountability really requires us to be curious about the unknown and the unexpected and the unpleasant, right? So all of those things can be emotionally painful. So what we need to do is learn how to process our emotions and challenge our defensive narratives to be able to get curious about failure. So this is a technique, I think, that all leaders need to learn. And those of us who are safety leaders, whether we're, manage people or not, we need to be able to do. So let's think about this. Now let's start with a trigger. So what is a trigger that really, so let's think about a pet peeve, something that you react to out of proportion to the violation, right? The trigger that really just makes you very ready to blame, or really ready to sort of throw yourself on the floor and say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. What kind of trigger out there? Sanjeev, I don't know if this varies much with gender. I I think it's kind of varies somewhat with what your understanding of yourself is and what your family environment is. With age, there are our emotional intelligence is something that we develop through social interaction. So there are some social emotional development that happens that is very much tied to age. So our ability to regulate this blame as a defense is something that we get better at as we get older. But I think our natural ego defenses, if you want to call them that, are things that we all do. Yeah, okay, so Tim, you've given me a great example. People that don't care and don't try. So in that, Tim, there is already your defensive narrative. You have the judgment that they don't care and they don't try. What is the behavior that you see, Tim, that tells you that people don't care and don't try? And you can just unmute yourself if you want. That's the trigger. The thing that you see that demonstrates that people don't care, then you don't try. Is that they're not doing
when they say, I don't care. And it's obvious by their actions that they don't, because they haven't put forth any effort.
Right. So they are not invested in
Right.
what you want them to do, or what your little society, your team, or whatever wants them to do. So they're pushing back, basically. And so the emotion that comes out of that, Tim, is it frustration? Is it anger?
It's usually frustration, because I think, there's a lot of people that would put themselves in that position if they had the chance, and they would try, and they just don't, they're not given the chance. And, I mean, not to get into the nuts and bolts of it, but, we see that stuff in our businesses, people that it's obvious by their actions that they've given up, and they're not trying anymore. They don't ask for help. They just don't do what's asked of them. And that frustrates me, because they're occupying a spot that, if it were filled, it would make everyone's job a lot easier.
Yeah. Okay. And that makes a lot of sense. So these narratives are really important for us to surface. And so what I hear from your narrative is there's people who've given up. They're not trying. And we could bring in somebody who has more of that motivation, who has that impetus. And we could be a better organization if we just had some people who truly cared. Now, that I think is a natural, normal narrative that we get from our operating in a society. These defensive narratives absolutely always make sense. The challenge for us in order to break out of a blame trap and actually start improving performance in our organization, especially, in thinking about the importance of safety, is we need to learn how to challenge those narratives. And challenge those narratives not in a way that, again, drives up our own defenses, but thinking about them differently. So when you think about that defense narrative, and we put on a lens of trying to understand it from their point of view, and Tim, don't have to put you on the spot. I can have other people help think this through with you. Let's look at people not asking for help, right, as this one observation that triggers this frustration and then drives this defense narrative. What might be an alternate way of looking at why it might make sense to not ask for help? Anybody?
Well, I mean, and everybody's free to chime in on this, but I'm bad about not asking for help.
Yeah.
That's one of my weaknesses, something that I've been consciously trying to get better at. But unfortunately, when I do ask for help, it usually reinforces why I don't ask for help. Because of the resistance and the people not coming through and things like that. So I end up doing things myself and not asking for help. So I understand why people don't ask for help sometimes, because I do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and just having that sort of understanding, right, that immediately diminishes that emotion of frustration because you can empathize with them. But your example also says how important it is for us to create an environment where we ask for help. You've learned to not ask for help because, one, people don't give good help. Or two, you've gotten some backlash or criticism when you've asked for help, and you still have a strong drive in your work and environment, in your work team, that it's more important to get something done yourself, to be able to do it efficiently, than to stop and ask for help and mess with a lot of other people's perceptions. Now, as a leader, we need to be looking at that social dynamic and saying, wait, I want people to be motivated. I want people to be empowered. So I need to create an environment where people can be empowered. So I need to change how we respond. I respond, and then other people will emulate me. I'm going to need to change how I respond so that asking for help is encouraged. I need to look at the pressures that people are under that drive them to avoid help and just do it themselves, or avoid helping others and just do it themselves, by rewarding that help giving, by giving people an opportunity, lifting off the pressure for efficiency and doing something now, and changing the meaning in our organization to doing it well is more important than doing it now. Learning and innovating and improving is, we're going to give space for that, because I recognize that it requires a bit of noodling time, to use Bob's word, or it requires us to experiment and fail and struggle a little bit. And I need to recognize that when people are in that learning mode and they're struggling a little bit, I need to give them a little bit of encouragement. I need to address the reality of the painful emotions when you're doing that, and make that okay, right? So those are all things that leaders need to do to create that environment that then changes this narrative, and then allows people to be more important, and changes ultimately that behavior that's triggering, because then people are allowed to be more empowered.
And
Chris,
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
go ahead, Chris Lemaster.
Chris has had his hand up for a little while, and Rhonda then.
My electronic hand is getting very tired.
Yes.
No, it's okay. Martha, I think we may have discussed this last week. But I was just thinking of a story of some nurses in the ER who, they hand off patients who are getting admitted to the hospital to nurses upstairs on the floor. And the stories that they tell themselves really matter. And one of the nurse leaders in that department, called us out with that language that, the nurses upstairs aren't available to receive the handoff. And so the patient needs to stay in the ER and the beds are filling up. And, the stories they tell themselves are like, geez, the nurses upstairs are taking 3-hour breaks. They're painting their nails, whatever. And, and then the nurses upstairs are like these ER nurses, like they don't give good handoffs and, blame, blame, blame. And the thing that just kind of melted all of that away and made the assumptions kind of go away was just to get some of those people in a room together to talk about what their work looks like. And then they were like, whoa, wow, these were all just stories I've been telling myself for a decade, and they're not true.
Yeah.
And that was really amazing, is creating space for people to talk to each other who don't normally speak to each other.
Absolutely. And I think empathy is a really quick and important way to challenge our defensive narratives. Our defensive narratives, especially when we're dealing in a blame situation, are very us versus them. And then empathy, which is, understanding somebody else's point of view, understanding how somebody else feels, understanding what somebody else might need from you. Those are the three elements of types of empathy. Trying to ask yourself that, well, what might be their perception to make their behavior make sense? How might they be feeling that might be driving what I'm seeing? What emotions might be driving these actions? And then, what help do they need from me? What are they missing? What information might they be missing? What resources might they be missing? What help do they need in order to do what I expect them to do or that I want them to do? That all of a sudden starts to break down our defensive narratives and puts us in a place where, we can support each other. I want to address what Kevin wrote here about, there's a difference between not asking for help because you learn better when you figure it out yourself, or not asking for help because you're indifferent. And I think we need to think about, this sort of indifferent, and Chris's example gives a great example of this, about when we judge people as being indifferent, or when people even say, Tim's example, people say, I don't care. That's true, that's real. But why? What does indifference ultimately mean? And Scott's point, I think, addresses this. Indifference is not feeling like you're a part of this team, not being engaged in this, not thinking it's your problem or your job, right? Who creates the opportunity to be engaged or indifferent? Ultimately, it's the leadership, the narratives that we drive, and the meaning that we make, like what makes being a part of this group meaningful. It's very easy to be indifferent when you're constantly being told to stay in your lane. It's very easy to be indifferent when your leader feels like it's their job to provide you with all of the answers and solve all of your problems, and you don't get an opportunity to even be involved in that. It's easy to be indifferent, even if your leader has great intentions, but they're trying to be the savior and they feel like they need to be the smartest person in the room all the time, right? So as leaders, we need to be aware, like we need to say, all right, I might be seeing this. Don't judge it as an attribute of this person. How can we create an environment where someone might be able to show up differently? Yeah, and so, Jen, indifference being a defense against overstress and high anxiety. Overstress and high anxiety, as leaders and as safety leaders, we need to address that environment in our workplaces. So I think that that's important. So the question is, how do we define accountability? How do we define blame? And how do we differentiate? Yeah, I think that's really important for us to think about. So let me see if I can go back to sort of how I would define accountability. Accountability is a systems integrity control. And right. And accountability is something that, you know, leaders, it's part of a leader's leadership practice to create accountability by providing clarification, by understanding a worker's situation and the framework in which they're making decisions, by providing them with the resources that they need, developing them in order to do what you're asking them to do. But accountability is just part of systems integrity control, and it touches lots of different systems. So, you know, let me ask all of you, like, and Loranda, I've just totally blown past what you were going to say. Should I stop now?
No, I just wanted to make sure that you caught Sanjeev's question as well.
Where was Sanjeev's question?
It was,
what does emotion element actually mean? Having emotions or being emotional? It might be there might be a difference. I don't see a difference between having emotions and being emotional. I mean, we can look at being emotional maybe as being part of somebody's personality trait, you know, where they express their emotions more. There's certainly in sort of the big five of emotions, and Elaine knows more about this than I do. You know, there's sort of a tendency towards more neurosis, you know, which is sort of more worrying, and that might cause people to show in their affect more emotionalness. But, you know, we all have emotions. Emotions are, you know, working and driving our behavior. They're coloring how we see the world. They're very, very fundamental to us. In fact, you know, the limbic system is shared by all mammals. When we think of instinct, you know, in our pets, in our pet cat and our pet dog, that really is just their emotions operating. And when we think of instinct ourselves or our gut feelings, that's our limbic system operating in our non-conscious background that's driving our more conscious decision making and our perceptions and, you know, our biases. So I don't know if I answered that question, Sanjeev. Okay. Where was I? I asked all of you sorry, where did I go? Here I am. I have to go find where I was just now. I'm just clicking randomly now. Think about the organization. If we look at accountability as a systems integrity control, what organizational systems do you think are involved in accountability? Okay, so accountability has to be placed before the actions occur, or blame, right? It comes after the actions have occurred, right? Yes, absolutely. This post failure accountability, holding people accountable, does not make any sense to me. We hold people accountable before that. The blame is just occurs when something happens that we don't like. And confusing that with accountability, you know, that's just an emotional reaction to something painful, which is normal, and we manage those emotions. There certainly we want to build into our systems integrity control a recovery method, right, for accountability, but blame is not a good recovery method. Our recovery method should be, okay, well, now let's look at where things didn't work. Let's look at whether there were, you know, mixed messages along the way, whether something was confusing, whether, you know, something that you needed in order to do this job safely wasn't available to you, all of those things that we look at when we do a HOP-based investigation and a learning team and a learning investigation. That's our accountability recovery part of our accountability system. Blame doesn't help that. Yeah. Okay, I'm catching up with some of the Yeah. So accountability is positive and allows organizations to make adjustments for success. Yeah, accountability is a system that's driving us towards the performance that we want. It doesn't mean that to be accountable means that you're performing perfectly all the time. It means that you're aware of how you are performing and that you have the ability to recover in that performance. So that's one thing. And then blame, its definition lives in a whole different world. Blame is an ego defense against painful emotions. It's just a natural reaction that we have to defend ourselves. And even though we learned socially, we learned that guilt and shame helps us conform to our societies, reinforces our norms and our taboos. That's not something that's going to help us be safe. I'm just doing things randomly here. Okay. So, yeah, right. Getting additional resources allocated for the help of success. Yeah, that's part of our accountability system, should be helping people, continually helping people succeed. So, I mean, the key thing here to start breaking these apart is do not try to reason away an emotional problem. How I see James Reason's culpability model now, I recognize where it came from. It came from a world where we would do an investigation and it would be human error. And we recognized that saying that it's human error didn't help anything. And so it started with sort of the assumption that blame is going to be there and that sometimes blame is justified. But blame it as an emotional problem. Making a chart about a decision tree about it is not what's going to help us. What we really need to be looking at when we're looking at a failure is going back to our accountability system and seeing if we have proper recovery mechanisms within our accountability system. This was just an argument to help people who had been focused on human error for a long time to let that go. Well, I think we're there, we're almost there. But allowing this emotional response, this blame response, to be a part of it and not to manage that differently is just creating a more difficult situation where it gets very hard for us to break up. So here's my proposal for the breakup. Build accountability by strengthening organizational, operational, and psychological systems through inquiry and learning. Our best recovery method within our accountability systems is inquiry and learning, and recognizing that organizational systems, how we define roles, our power structures within our organization, how we define and manage success, that's part of our accountability system. Our operational systems, our procedures, our communication within our operations, that also becomes part of our accountability system. Our psychological systems, how we create psychological safety, how we create an opportunity for people to manage their difficult emotions, those also support our accountability systems. Then actively manage our emotions from uncertainty and surprise and disappointment separately. That's part of, I think, what it is to be a leader, is to develop our emotional intelligence to a point where we can emotionally regulate our teams and we can emotionally regulate ourselves, so that we recognize that those emotions happen, but we minimize the bias that they can introduce by just, having a time when something bad happens for people to process it, to mourn it, to talk about it, to express their frustrations, to verbalize their defense narratives, and then be able to address those defense narratives and continue to reframe that so that we can create a system of meaning for people that allows them to be successful at work. Okay, could blame culture be a reason for human errors in a situation or a team? Certainly a blame, yes, the blame cycle that James Reason taught us, blame driving out learning, means that we're introducing more biases, that we're introducing more blind spots. There's less information available to us as we make decisions as we work. That creates a highly error-prone environment so that people with limited information make less effective decisions. So yeah, absolutely, Sanjeev. All right. Breakup conversation with a cat. It's not me, it's you. Yes, absolutely. We got a few minutes. I am quite happy to just let everybody ask any questions that you have or share anything that you have about this. Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. Blame drives out communication, and that is a thread in so many events. And the event reports that I've read, absolutely, it's the stuff that you don't know, the things that people haven't communicated. Very much that psychological part, that psychological system of, you know, whether we've been actively creating psychological safety where people can, you know, say that something's a problem or not, or feel like they can't, that has a huge thing. Yeah. All right.
Well,
Is
Martha,
there,
this has been great.
yeah, Tanya. We're right. Tanya, is there such thing as a willful violation? I mean, there's such thing as sabotage, Tanya, and that's not really my field. Like Mark McElhaney is the person to talk about with that. You know, he's the person who deals with and studies the people who put poison in Coke and, you know, all of that stuff. I'm going to stop sharing here. Yeah, but that's just it. I mean, I want to say it's super rare, Tanya, and it's not really, but it's also not as rare as it used to be. So that also is recognizing that our societal systems and the fact that for many of us, definitely here in the United States, we are seeing a breakdown of some of our societal supports that create the meaning that says we're not supposed to hurt other people on purpose. But that's something, yeah, that needs to be handled separately. It becomes a societal issue, and then we have all of our criminal systems to deal with that. And that's, I think, too much to ask. I mean, a leader needs to be aware of that and knows when to say, we need to approach this as true malfeasance. And having a strong accountability system will help us better see those major deviations when we have a real bad actor. But
This has been wonderful, Martha. Thank you so much. There's been a lot here in the chat that I know you're also trying to catch up with as well, but I think we got most of the questions that were in the chat. And thank you to everybody who participated, you know, coming off of mute and interacting, as well as everything that you contributed to everyone else in the community through chat. Jessica also dropped a couple of things in the chat about the upcoming conference in Henderson, Nevada. It's going to be June 11th through the 13th, and there are pre and post conference workshops that are available. And if you're there, you'll get a chance to see Martha and chat a little bit more with her. And Martha, do you have, oh, one more thing. Wanted to make sure I mention the awards that are new this year. So if you want to nominate someone for our Vanguard Visionary Award, which you can find more information about on that link, or another new award that has to do with case studies. It's kind of like an advanced learning concept kind of award. Please check that link out on the website and nominate yourself. You can do that, or a colleague, you can do that as well. But Martha, any closing remarks?
Yeah, Jen's asking me for a link to my book. I am desperately trying to finish. I am fallible and I make mistakes, and I have not yet finished my book, even though I have promoted it and as a way of thinking that that would motivate me, but it didn't work. But I am working very hard to have a link to the book by the time we get to the conference in June. So very, very close. No, that's okay. I need pressure, Jen. All right, so no, that's it. I really hope to see you all in Henderson and or see you here in Santa Fe for the Conklin conference, or or just see you around as I do. I appreciate all of you.
All right. Thank you, Martha, so much. We, the community, appreciate you. And for everyone, again, that joined, thank you, thank you, thank you. We're looking forward to hopefully seeing you all in Henderson, Nevada in June. Again, please take a look at the website for more information on the conference and the awards. Have a good afternoon, everybody.